my guest today is Melissa McVeigh. She's a digital product director at Opposite Days, and she'll also be speaking at the e-commerce design summit, and we'll sort of go there during our conversation as well, what the talk will be about. So welcome, Melissa. Can you talk a bit about what your background is and why you're doing what you're doing, and then we'll sort of take that as a starter into our conversation.
Cool. Thank you and welcome everyone. I have to say this is the first time I've done one of these, so it's very exciting to do a live webcast. So what's my background? I work in a small network, Opposite Days, that I lead. And what we do as a company is basically go into organizations and help them build out their product strategy and their culture. And so over the last sort of 8 or 9 years while being in London, I'm originally from Australia, I have worked at a variety of organizations to basically build out both the practice and the products that they deliver. So at the moment I'm at Condé Nast globally. So for those that don't know, Condé Nast is one of the largest publishers in the world. So, you know, the lovely luxury titles of Vogue and GQ and Wired. And they and we are going through a major transformation at the moment. So there are 14 markets of which Condé Nast operate in digitally, so anywhere from the US and all of Europe, Russia and China. And they have 32 titles, so Vogue, GQ, Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, etc. And from a product and technology standpoint, my brief as a transformation lead is to not only bring what is currently 2 organizations, the US and the Condé Nast International, but actually look at the product portfolio and what we make for our customers across any of the touch points. And so it's a really large scale program of work. The team here is about, I think 300, well, it's probably about 500 across product and technology. And a lot of it is actually around people and culture. Some other things that I've worked on is I developed the first e-commerce sort of product for Telegraph Travel. So integrating a commerce platform and, well, a product and an experience design connected to their content, and basically looked outside of publishing for other revenue streams. The same with Mr. and Mrs. Smith, which is a luxury travel hotel provider. Did some work with Time Out, so travel is a specialism of mine. And then ultimately, and Photobox was the last other company, so the largest photo retailer online. As a very quick how I got here, my background is quite diverse. I come from a creative. I started in the internet a very long time ago. So if I track through every single sort of thing led me to here. So I started as a business analyst and a project manager back in the day, then moved into what was information architecture. So learning about data and, you know, how to structure things. And then through that, as UX as a discipline was kind of created, I was at the beginning of that. So UX and strategy and research and all the elements that create great design, bringing in the creative skills, and then now effectively at a sort of strategic level product. So that's kind of the intro.
All right. Thank you, Melissa. Let's start actually right there. So when I did some research on you, I saw that you've been in the product business and UX business since 2000 already. That's quite a while. How would you say has UX and product sort of evolved over the past, 18 years, 19 years?
Yeah, that gives away my age to an extent. I mean, I think that it's around the internet. I mean, regardless of product and UX, like I literally taught myself to code HTML in this new world. You know, when you didn't have email and you were working off modems. I think it's the nature of, and the discipline of design or UX didn't exist, right? You were just making stuff and throwing it online, and it very much. I mean, I came from an actual publishing design background, so I was taking designs and converting them online. They're beautiful if I look back at them. I think how it's changed, really, if I do look, and I've got old books, is that everything now looks very similar, because of the way we build and the way we create, and that is both good and bad. but it actually means that the content becomes way more relevant because you're looking at a design system that's quite universal and to some extent quite commoditized. So if you're kind of creating something, if you think about it in a, say, a Vogue context, how do you differentiate in a market? Even though the brand has cachet, you know, if the design systems and stuff are very similar to what's online, how do you actually make the product look different? That's no different to print, though. You know, a print magazine, it ultimately comes down to your brand.
So when you start a new project, especially a massive one like now at Condé Nast, how, I mean, what kind of questions do you ask when you come in? You know, what are the first sort of prompts you ask the teams when you come in?
So there's 2 or 3 sort of levels to that. One of the first things actually I listen and observe the organisation, and because I'll have ideas, everyone does when they come in new to a project, whether you're consulting, contract or perm, and it's really important to understand the way the culture currently works, and in the context of that culture, what the stories are that they tell themselves. So is it a positive story? Is it an inspiring story? Is it a negative story? Because you get a sense of the problems that are existing within the culture of the organisation. So if everyone's negative, you know, that's usually a symptom of they're not working together. Or if things are going really well, how do you add value? So before we even get to how we're going to work together, that's kind of the first thing. The other 2 are really around what kind of product organisation do you want to be? You know, in product in particular, you can go into organisations that are very development heavy and have very little design there, or if they have design, they're quite small. And it ultimately comes back to the strategy, both the needs of the business and then also showing them better ways. So assessing, you know, what kind of organisation exists and therefore what the end state needs and should be. And then ultimately, once you kind of get those building blocks and you can see what's kind of happening, it's actually challenging the brief per se, or challenging the question. So we all have problem statements, we all have things we're solving. And my first question was always, is it the right question? And if people can't answer that, then you're probably on a path to know that it isn't the right question or the right problem. That everyone can solve a problem. The question is it the right one?
Do you see patterns in mistakes that a lot of companies make in this sort of new era of product and user experience online? Do you see any patterns there?
Yes, like the one that I've seen universally is the lack of vision. So, and that is because by the nature of product or engineering and doing it quick and incremental and get things out and learn with users, that is very important. You still need to know the question and the problem you're solving for. You cannot answer that, or in fact have a North Star, then half the time if you don't know what you're developing for or why. And so, and universally we talk customer centric, but if you were to ask the teams who the customer is, a lot of the time they can't answer that question. So
if, let's say, I'm working at a company and I don't know at all what our vision is, or at least different employees have different understandings of what the vision is or what the customer is. Where do you start? I mean, how do I arrive at a vision that makes sense in the employees' heads and also sort of inspires them, but also to the customer? So where do I start if I don't have anything today, or if there's very different?
Yeah, it's quite simple. Some of the work we're doing here at the moment, starting with the culture internally and looking at the stories that have been told. And so and Condé Nast is nice in that context because as a business, they understand how important stories are, if that makes sense, because it's a company on storytelling. And so one of the sort of bits of work we're doing at the moment is around what is our story. Because if you know what the story is and everyone can align around it, then you actually align, like you naturally get the teams talking to the same drumbeat and the same, kind of playlist, whatever kind of term you want to use. And so the way that I do that is with a lot of collaboration and workshops, and it will feel like a waste of time. I've got to deliver, I've got to do, I'm task oriented, I've got to ship, I've got to get code out. But actually, if you don't spend the time going why, right? And, that is a hard thing. We're all time poor, but if you don't go why, you'll never get to that vision. So it's actually, and it's not done in an ivory tower. It's done with the teams on the ground. And so at the moment, we're weaving through kind of a workshop series. Think of it like a holiday or a journey. We're going on a little adventure and exploring what it is. And actually, by the next 3 months, we'll have our vision. It won't be given to them as a presentation and then told to believe and deliver on it. They will have actually created it.
And so what kind of assets or, what are you looking at inside a company to arrive at a story that makes sense in people's heads and to a strong why? What assets are you pulling in? Who is involved?
Yeah, so hopefully your company has a strategy. So that's kind of the first point of call. Now that strategy is often a very commercial one, right? We want to grow business by X and we feel there's an opportunity in Y, and it's market-led and market research. The translation layer of that is the customer. So a lot of the work that we're doing here is with the head of data and insight is what do we know about our customers at the moment? Now, in the context of that level of data, it's lagging, it's known information, right? Because you're seeing a pattern of behavior. But that's off the existing product, right? So although we do a lot of call here as well, we have a fantastic team here doing data and insight and research. We have spent, if I have to say, a couple of weeks mulling around our question, right? And then not probing the data, but saying, in the way for, I tend to refer it to the teams is that we tend to do the strategy by making things and exploring a topic, probably more like an artist would, because I have a creative background. It's a way an artist would explore actually quite seemingly disconnected ideas and bring them together. So you take all the existing research. We actually do a little bit about what's happening in the market, so kind of trends and so forth. And then as you start to do that, you'll start to see ideas form, if that makes sense. And then from that, we glean our question. So we're not really writing the brief until after we've done the research. If we're missing information, like if we're missing research, then we'll go and gather it. So if we need to, interview people or go out and do diary studies or anything like that, that's often at the back of, well, what do we have to date? And then what else do we learn? But it's a mixture of what are the headwinds, you've got the commercials, what are the headwinds in the business, and then what are the users actually doing, not just with our products, but within our industry. So fashion, we can say we want to grow Vogue online, but actually at the same time, our audience behavior is really different to how it consumes fashion content now.
And when we talk about, especially the initial customer research, quantitative or qualitative, what kind of questions do you ask to get the right data? Because oftentimes you have vast amounts of data and sort of need to slice and dice it. What questions do you ask the team so that they get the data that is relevant in the end?
Because data is this information, right? So data, we have lots of it and people can hide behind it. And the key is to get the insight. So the questions that I tend to sort of ask people, and it's also a language that we use, whether we're writing OKRs and KPIs to how we tell our stories, is describe it in a more scenario or customer-led way. So often the question then the behavioural, which is if our product ostensibly is within fashion, the question's often around how are you consuming, fashion content and for what purpose? So think about it, actually, let's put fashion aside, travel, right? Everyone wants to reinvent travel. And travel has a very simple paradigm of you're inspired, so you look at lots of different destinations, or you know where you want to go. And so that doesn't change. It has never changed. I've worked in travel for 20 years. I don't know whether it's a guidebook or a website. So that's a known opportunity. The question then is how do you create a narrative to ultimately get people to buy your product or consume your content. And so it's looking at then how people make decisions about where they want to go. Is it a website? Is it a newspaper? Is it their friends? And then you have to, drive your product off the back of those behaviours. not I have all this content that I need to push out. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And how do you, how much of it, especially in the initial phase, is looking at data, and how much is actually going out and speaking to customers, and in which sequence are you doing that? I mean, how can you walk us through the process?
Yeah. So the process is never sequential. So I've worked with teams that often find this part of the process quite hard, because if you're quite sequential, you don't get disconnected ideas connecting. So we run them in parallel paths. Mm-hmm. So imagine they're not quite like design sprints, but imagine every week we so in the Telegraph, we did it in 6 weeks. So we had a small team that was commercial, editorial, finance, and design. And actually we would do a little bit of research, and then we would design something, and then we would test it. So a lot of the techniques, I suppose, of market research, it wasn't conceptual testing with shapes and patterns and so forth. It was actually designs. So we would work with the design team to mock, concepts, and then test them. So that by the time we presented the strategy to the board, not only did we, so if I think about the end point, mm-hmm. think like a pitch in an advertising world, but mm-hmm. it's a pitch that can actually be built. It's not an idea to win work. Yeah. So if you think about that as an end point, what is the strategy that we make? It's a presentation, it's a prototype, it's a business plan, a variety of things. To get there, we run parallel tracks. Research at the bottom, each week, understanding if there are different questions to probe, commercials, how is it going to make money? And then the design, because the design will ultimately determine how you build it. But that design is also done with engineering. So it is a made thing that is validated. So if you look at the, say, triangles I'm drawing with my hands, feasibility, and, kind of desirability and so forth, the feasibility is also done. So the budget that we'd say, right, it's going to cost X, has been validated because engineering have gone, yeah, it doesn't then get pushed over the fence and engineering go, well, we don't have the data model for that. It's going to take 4 times as long. So the business also has confidence that going to get what we're proposing that they need. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And build that into a POC, so you get it to market really quick to see whether or not the idea works.
And then, so how much information are you gathering in order to inform a product strategy beforehand? I mean, on the one side, you want to gather enough data in order to produce something new or improved that is based on research. But on the other side, you also want to get something out fairly quickly, so you're not in the room the whole day. How much research do you do, whether that's quantitative or qualitative, and how do you strike the balance?
I think it's more about the size of the team, right? So at Photobox, we had a very small research team of 2 or 3. They were working all day, every day. We had 8 or 9 product teams. So product teams are probably testing once a week. And then depending on either the UX team within the product would run the test, or it would be the research. But all of that, I think the other point of that was to be able to scale it. We democratized everything. So we didn't over-research. Once we knew an answer, if we had a similar problem in a different area, we didn't have to go back and research it again, because we had sort of the data. Does that make sense? Which I think, people can over-research. So the thing is, it's probably about 20 or 30% of time, but it's ongoing. It basically follows the life cycle of the product. It's not at the beginning, it's not in isolation, and you're moving through a life cycle of the qual and quant, like learning to actually, I have a product, does it work?
And to make a quick segue from here, what do you think are the most important skills today for a product manager? Like if you would have to, maybe whether that's in a smaller company, which might be a bit different, but also in a big company, what kind of, if I'm a product manager today, what skills are worth investing in?
So on the soft skills, the power of, not persuasion, it might sound negative, but the power of persuasion and negotiation, you need to be able to sell your story, right? Mm-hmm. So that means you need to be able to present, you need to be able to create a compelling argument as to why your team's ideas work. The other one that I feel that is really lacking the more senior you get is actually people management. If, you know, as you start to get larger teams, if you don't understand the importance of how to build systems and rituals and processes beyond a sprint plan, etc., but you're scaling. A very interesting piece of advice in the beginning of my career was that I was very ambitious and I wanted to do, like, you know, a massive project, and the CEO at the time, the head of operations, said, look, you're great, talented, but you can't jump from one project to 25, right? That's a skill, completely different skill. But you go from 1 to 3, 3 to 10, 10 to 25. So you learn how to manage multiple products and projects. And that is, I took that to heart. And actually he also taught me the art of presentation. They were the two things that I was taught by him. So they are fundamental skills that any product manager would need. The other one is actually the head of HR that I used to work with would also say, you know, organizational change means people are 100% resistant to change, even if it's like a brand new product that you're launching.
Yeah.
So you need to understand, you know, things like resistance and why people don't want to do them. So that's taking them on a journey. So a lot of the storytelling skills. On a very practical side, you need to know your craft. It is not saying that you need to know how to code or you need to know how to design, but you do need to have an empathy and a sympathy, because they're actually two different mindsets. It's why there's always that design versus product or design versus engineering. They work in different ways, and if you want a cross-functional team, and you need to know how things are built so you can call bluff. Sounds like a lot, but I am not an engineer by trade, right? But I can talk. It's like learning a multiple language. You know, I can talk engineering. So I can also then push them when I think an idea isn't right or a data model could be done another way. And that's because I'll go to events on a very wide range of things, because it also makes me a better strategist. So I dip in just enough, because ultimately I'm pulling together a puzzle of very disconnected parts.
And so this theme of storytelling comes up quite a bit also in these fireside chats, and also in our conversation right now. So if I'm today, I don't know anything about storytelling. I'm coming from a very technical background. I mean, where do I start? Do you have how did you develop that skill of telling a good story? Whether that's books or you know, how did you get into it? Where did you start, and how do you keep developing it?
Yeah, well, it started, it's not my secret identity, but, you know, I went to art school. So my degree is in art and in photography. And when I was choosing between commercial and art, my teacher said, you don't need to do commercial. Everyone can learn how to light. If you do art, you learn how to tell a story. And it's actually true for any discipline, as I say that out loud. Like, anyone can learn how to code. Anyone can learn how to design. But the craft is being able to tell a story. There's a really amazing documentary, because I watched it when I joined here, another way of describing it on Netflix, called Franca. And Franca was, and it's called Chaos, and can't remember, but she was the editor of Italian Vogue, died a few years ago. It was an amazing documentary. And Italian Vogue is the best in the art context, compared to, say, US or French Vogue, etc. And the story that was told was that she was like, I wanted to have a different voice, and I wanted to have, you know, a presence of, you know, obviously Vogue, you know, Italy, but no one spoke Italian. So the only way I could have a voice was through photography. And photography is a very interesting craft, because you have to say things without words, and it's a universal language because you don't need verbal language. And so whenever I've kind of coached people, one of the 2 or 3 things I have universally said, if you want to learn storytelling, don't go to a course on how to present. Go and learn how to do theatre or theatre sports, or things that force you, like a more creative, it'll feel tangential, but theatre sports is a technique where you have to learn to improv. So going and doing a weekend course in improvisation, it will teach you the craft of a story. I'm doing to also like refresh is like looking at, you know, filmmaking or other things where you learn the craft of story. You learn how to storyboard. You learn how to weave together a narrative from a beginning and end. Now, ultimately, when you look at it, that's just a presentation, right?
Mm-hmm.
You want to abstract it back into, oh, I'm not a creative person, I can't be creative. Well, actually, you can, and you can weave it back into your work. And so I push people out. I mean, and it's amazing when they come back, how clearer, how succinct they are. They've learned techniques around big ideas. So the thing about art is you go for a big idea and then you bring it back into the nugget, into the vision, into the statement. You don't start with the statement. So often I say when we're doing strategic work, the strategy doesn't appear until the end. You think you need the strategy before you deliver, but I go backwards, which is let's create and go through all the cloud, and then when you get the vision, actually the delivery becomes really easy because everyone's very focused. And so there are 2 or 3 books that I've read recently. I'll have to bring them up because I wrote them down, but I've been sharing them with everybody. One is called Curious, and it was very much around how curiosity works. And it's by a writer, I think he's either a neuroscientist or a researcher, and by Ian Leslie. And the other one is actually Beth Comstock, who Imagine It Forward, who ran GM, the head of marketing, and had no skills in marketing and product and so forth. And the book tells an incredible story about how she ended up running GM kind of creativity and innovation globally. They're the 2 that I give to people and say both of those are very much around curiosity.
And so, I mean, also telling a story online only. So if you're a SaaS product or something like that, do you have some companies that people can look at that do a very good job at that, that have distilled the story to a point where it gets really across online as well?
Nothing. Okay. Maybe to reframe that in the context of when you've got a product that's more of a utility, right? It's not about necessarily telling a story, but it is about creating an experience that's easy to use, right? So if we think about actually the story elements usually the brand, we've got, if you think about it in terms of, food delivery, food delivery is not actually a new thing. It has been commoditized, globally, so you can do it anywhere in the world. But the difference between Uber Eats and, Deliveroo or whatever it is in any country technically isn't any different. You go in, you order food, etc. The story that they create around it is often around the images they use, the text, and context. If you want to actually go back to a question you had before, one of the universal things that most UX people do not do is use real content and real images. And so if you're testing, you're already biased if you're not using what it could potentially look like. Because the thing that we all relate to universally is images. If you use a stock image, you're going to get a completely different response. And if you until you put the real stuff in, and content often goes in last. And in any of the projects that I do, particularly because they're visual, we start with the content. Right? If you don't test with the right content, if you don't test, then you're actually going to get a false result. And designers try and make things look pretty, but that's ultimately not what you're trying to test for, right? Does that make sense?
And also, I mean, how much you mentioned competitor research before. I mean, a big part of that is oftentimes also to have your position in the market. So how much are you trying to be different and have your own voice, looking at the competitors, what they're doing, versus just starting from the inside of the company and see what comes out?
Well, it's both. It depends. I mean, I tend to work in really big, established, companies. Condé Nast has a heritage of over 100 years.
Yeah,
Gives it a huge amount of, power, regardless of the products it produces or the quality of the products it produces. A startup or a SaaS platform is quite different, right, in terms of, where it's starting from, and it has to create, visibility in the industry before it even gets to necessarily a story, if that makes sense.
Okay, so let's take another bit of a segue from here. What advice would you give sort of you said you were a driven product manager. Today, what if you meet someone that is driven and smart and they really want to have an impact, what advice would you give them? And maybe also what popular advice should they ignore?
I usually always say ignore all advice, and I'll give a reason for that in a minute. But one of the bits of advice, because I had to do this to a lot of my younger team in one of my previous roles, because everyone thought I'm ambitious, I'm amazing, I'm 25, I should be ahead of. And my advice to them was the advice I was given at 25, which is there are things that you don't know, and there are things you need to know, and you can't and shouldn't be basically promoted until you know them. And so actually being really honest with your bosses and your peers and etc., and say, what skills don't I have that I need to have? So every time I didn't get a job because I wasn't promoted, etc., I would say why. What was the reason why I didn't get it? And they'd say very clearly why. So then I went and got that skill. And I think that people have to be aware that they're not perfect at everything, and therefore it's not a negativity, but it is a reflection of where you are in your career, and be really honest about it. Because actually that also gets you, well, I've always found that's actually got me where I've got to today. On the other side though, having had done this for quite some time, I actually say career is the least important thing you should worry about. One of the best bits of coaching and advice that I got was I designed the life that I wanted and then found the job to fit that. So it isn't about my career. I mean, my career is fundamental. I'm very driven. But I actually reflected back on the life that I wanted to lead. And that was the best bit of coaching. So I have a life plan. I don't have a career plan. And my career and my lifestyle, because I travel a lot and I have a job that allows me to travel, was off the back of the life plan. And I get all of my team, when they ask for the career roadmap, I say, I don't want to know your career roadmap. I actually want to know. So if your life plan is I want kids, or I want to be quite settled, or I'm buying my house, or my parents are sick and I need time off, or I've got my creative side project, so I want time off, design the job around that. Because if you're working 20 hours a day, you're kind of in the wrong gap. Like, you're going to wake up one day and realize it was probably a waste of time. So that's actually the best advice I can give.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting tension. How do you, when you take a step back and look at when you sort of designed your life plan, if you want, I mean, what kind of questions do you ask yourself when you design a life plan that you want your career to fit in, if you want?
Yeah, because I mean, I'll be really honest, because I'd suffered burnout. So it was about finding balance. And so what the coach made me do there was imagine what my perfect life would be. So I wrote a story. I still have it. So I wrote an imagined story of the life that I wanted. I'm a single mum, so it was like, basically the story was, I want enough flexibility in my role to, because I'm a single mum and I don't have as much support on the ground, and I travel all the time, so I need to have a job that supports that as well. And I want to grow my career in design and work in a certain industry, travel. So when she said that, we went, well, you don't want to run a company. So as in you don't want a company with offices and overheads and staff you have to pay for, etc. So I don't have that. I have a network of people I work with, 10 to 20 people, no overheads. I work consulting. I don't have a perm job. So if I need to stop for school holidays, I do. And because I was Australian, I go home a lot. I know the amount of money I need to earn, and that's the life I have now. So it's just really, it goes back to the questions you ask yourself. Imagine, and I'm lucky, I'm really blessed, but other people have different, family is sick, or they're raising they've got 3 or 4 children each. And then it takes away all that tension about I'm not doing enough, or I'm stretched, and all that sort of stuff.
Okay, so you basically went from your ideal life that you want to live, and then went into how can I make this work for myself and make a career inside that life that I imagined then.
Yeah.
Okay.
So and so I don't consider myself a workaholic anymore, and I had really good time. It took a really long time, but again, when people sort of saying career advice, I got coaching, and it was fantastic. It was 3 sessions, very simple.
How do you go about? I mean, this comes up more and more as well. This coaching aspect, especially also around what you mentioned before. You know that we need to know what we don't know. In a way, in order to develop, and also what we want, in which direction we want to develop, and we have our own blind spots sometimes. How do you choose a coach? I mean, how did you go about that? Maybe especially for people that work a lot as well, because in the digital age you see that a lot, and also in people I talk to in my network. How do you go about that?
It's no different to the techniques you use in research, right? I wrote myself a little brief, right?
Really? Oh, yeah.
Like in terms of the questions that I was trying to ask, like that in that, I've had 3 or 4 different coaches at different times, and the brief was always around what opportunity. I don't like the word problem statement, but what am I trying to solve for? At that time with that coach, it was around lifestyle, because I was struggling at the time to find work. I hadn't worked for about 3 or 4 months. And so I was recommended a coach through my network. She's become a really good friend. I've had coaching very specifically about managing large-scale teams. So all at Photobox, that problem we were solving for was I was struggling at the time to transition. You know how I said managing 1 team to 8, 25. I was struggling from going to the 25. So I had very specific coaching about how to, again, manage time and energy, how to be clear and communicate to large-scale teams. And that's how, like, my job here, which is managing even more, not managing, but actually advising a global organization, is off the back of that coaching. It's also going back to being really hyper-aware and allowing, not always, a lot of people don't like to hear what they're not doing well. And so when you're doing research, no different. I ask people, what can I improve upon? And then design the solution. Like, okay, if I need to improve in this area, then I find a coach that can help me in that area. Not every coach can help you with every topic. Not like every research method won't give you every answer. The same answer.
Yeah, that's so basically bring your research mindset into your private life. That's interesting. Yeah. Well, what I like to ask that what sort of one of your favorite mistakes or failures that you made in your life that you learned a lot from? Because I always feel like when you ask that question, people realize that actually you can learn from mistakes. So I always like to, what's your favorite failure?
I got asked that in an interview question once, actually here when I came in here to interview, and I said, I don't like to think that I've had failures. I've had things go wrong. Like, I've had assumptions on products, right, that weren't right, but I never killed a business as a result of it. Like, we had an assumption, it didn't work. It felt really crap that it didn't work. So it technically was a failure, but all that it meant was that the business didn't grow at the rate that we thought. And so the reflection is on that context is making sure that stuff is good enough to go out, but goes out early enough to learn. So we just pivoted, and we were able to hit the target in that context. So I'm not so precious as much anymore about it being the right thing and nothing else will work, because I've learned that. And also some things work in some companies and the same idea doesn't work for another. That's been a massive learning for me. Is I had a similar strategy for 2 companies, and one doubled their revenue and one had no impact. Same idea. Yeah. On a personal level, the biggest kind of failure, and I'd said it actually at the interview here, was sacrificing my life for work. So I don't do that anymore. So the work-life balance is something I've literally had to work on. So the failure was, and forgetting the creative self and how that actually feeds funnily enough, it came from one of my coaching, that a day off a week that I have to be creative actually makes me more productive in the 4 days that I'm here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. In our quick talk before this conversation, you mentioned that, so you have like a creative day. How does that look like? So what are you doing on those days?
Yeah, so I want, because before I moved to the UK, my business was half photography, half digital, and when I moved here for financial reasons, I pushed the photography aside, so I didn't take photos for a year. So for 10 years, and then now every Friday I'm basically in the studio. So I'm making my own now. I'm just basically making my own, doing my own projects and exhibiting and so forth. And it's a religiously kept day.
Yeah.
And I used to always dream of it. It was in my life plan, and I never did it because I was always, I've got a meeting, I've got to do this,
right.
I've got to help someone, I've got to. And I literally now, and they really respect it here. I might do 5 minutes of email just to check in, but because I was very clear on the way that I want to work, they were like, yep, fine. So I think that being very clear, people just allow it to happen. The failure is when you say one thing and then you allow all the other noise to come in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I hear this pattern a lot with successful people that I talk to, where they allow themselves time to think and try to experiment with ideas that they have, and it's also these crossroads of different fields that bring about new ideas for your work life as well. And oftentimes we are very narrowed in the project we are currently doing, that we sometimes forget that there might be other solutions out there, that when we just take 1 or 2 steps back once a week is great. Yeah.
It is, but if you really put it in, say, practical professional terms, like that's the challenges I have with product and engineering and shipping code and just doing an incremental, and we're doing a sprint and get an idea and release it, right? If you look at any research on neuroscience or in the way that the brain works or how ideas connect, and if you read the books like Curiosity, there's a significant amount of research that will talk about your brain is working even when it's asleep, right? And if you don't allow it to basically relax when it's a muscle, all the tension, the anxiety, the body and break down. So there's a physical impact. But if you're a strategist and you are a creative person, you will think that you are doing nothing, but actually your brain is working. So even if I'm in the studio, like I get in the next day and then the strategy or the problem I've been trying to solve, it'll have landed. But if I'm working 24/7 and doing emails and in a certain kind of brain pattern, those ideas can't connect.
Yeah.
So it's actually a very big part of the work week, because it allows, everything takes time, allows things to cook. They ruminate.
Absolutely. Yep.
And we do not in professional practice, particularly in country or cities like London and New York. I can feel it. I spend a lot of time in Spain, so the rhythm of the cities is really different. We can see how that impacts the way people behave, make decisions, and actually ultimately build things, if that makes sense.
When you talk to teams, do you talk about this kind of stuff as well? I mean, about having a creative practice besides the professional life and stuff like that, or is that mostly out of the context? Is it more professional, or are you almost also coaching the people as well, where you in the teams that you work in?
Yeah, it depends on the discipline and the questions they're asking. We're running an offsite next week in New York with all the leadership team, and it's funnily enough, it took us 6 weeks to get to the design of it, and we've been working with a fantastic organisation called Hyper Island, who do loads of courses on creativity and experience design. And if anyone wants to do any of the courses, I would massively recommend Hyper Island as an organisation. They do, training and educational stuff, but also corporate. And we had struggled with the design of this event because it's an experience unto itself. We have very clear deliverables, the product and tech team. And then, walking my own walk, after 6 weeks, and the tension and so forth. Yesterday it landed finally. And it's around telling stories. And even though we have very clear deliverables, but that took 4 or 5 weeks, right? And I have to remind myself constantly to also trust that process, even though I go, I want the answer.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then I go back and go, come on, Mel, if you just, yeah. And then yesterday, the 3 of us, it just literally, it was effortless. But it needed that storming and forming. It needed that tension space for us to get to that outcome, which means it's
yeah. I mean, you're right. Sometimes you're stuck, even though the solution will come with time. But in the moment where you're stuck, you're like, oh, this is not going to work or something like that. But you need to trust the process sometimes, especially if you...
Which is why you need to understand when I talked earlier about persuasion and other techniques. So if that happens in a team, I will often stop a meeting and say, look, I know we've got this time served. We are now not going to get the result that we need. Let's take a break and reconvene hours later or tomorrow. 9 times out of 10, the team will then solve it anyway in another way. But if you keep forcing the issue, you just create more negative tension and anxiety. Yeah. As a product manager, you need to be able to read your room and say, right, it's like having kids, right, separate. So, kids aren't playing nice together. You separate them to take away the energy. And then they come back together when they're ready to form. And so again, and you learn that in theatre, all these things that I feel are disconnected, they're actually not, because it's ultimately about humans working together. So you have to understand the techniques, not just of the very practical, rational tasks that you do, but how groups and how humans make, like how they work. When you add a cultural aspect to that, American, French, German, Chinese, you've got different ways of thinking, working. And a job as a product manager is being able to effectively script that, like know how to navigate all the different personalities.
Yeah, that is fantastic advice. That's fantastic advice. So I want to be mindful of your time. We have a couple more questions. If you have any questions for Mel, put them now into the chat. So you are going to speak at the e-commerce summit. What are you going to speak about? What's the focus of this presentation or this session, and who is it for? Who are you?
Yeah, so it's around the theme of it's about how you get to product strategy and the storytelling aspect of it, right? And how you make, well, I call it strategy by making, and it's no different to prototyping or any other of those practices. But as a way, as I said before, that it is a process to make the strategy. It isn't something that's done and handed over. And it will weave through the data and the insight, but also curiosity, the other parts that we need. So, yeah, it will weave through a few of the themes that we talked about today.
Interesting. So somebody asked if you can mention the books again. So one was Curious. And
Curious, I can put it in.
Or maybe you can quickly put it in the chat. Exactly.
My favorite, the one by Ian Leslie is my favorite at the moment, and then the other one is Spencer Comstock. What was it called? I should remember that. Imagine It Forward, and that's a much more traditional American, management kind of thing about how she put creativity and innovation into GM. So, a global 200,000 organisation, but she came from NBC. So it's a very interesting, and a story obviously was a very successful woman. So it was quite a nice read.
Do you have any other books or resources, maybe books that you gift often, can also be outside necessarily of product management itself, that you give out to friends and colleagues that really they should read once in their lifetime?
Yeah, there is. The other one that I read last year on my sabbatical was called The Time Paradox. So it's a fantastic book on the research of how time works. And that's why it's transformative in my perception of time. And so there's all this research about how, as humans, we perceive time. So your perception of the past, the future, and the present, and then how you perceive all those three determines actually your levels of happiness. So it's an amazing book, but it also then talks about how you can't be too much future facing, because then you don't live in the now. You can't be in the now because you don't worry about And if you have a negative view on the past, you'll never move forward. So it's all about the behavior, like how you perceive time. And that's therefore me now, all the advice. Time is the only currency. Doesn't mean money, whatever. You cannot buy back time.
Interesting. Okay.
So,
Yeah, time paradox, you said, right?
Yeah. And it's by... Okay, cool. I've got, other weird ones, but they're the best, right? They're the ones I literally universally came back last year and made everyone read.
Awesome. So a few parting thoughts. What sort of, if you meet a new business contact, what sort of advice do you hear often, where you feel like that's something you would like to share for people? I mean, you said before you don't necessarily want to give too much advice, but if you would have to sum up in a sentence or two what you would advise people on to how to live their professional life, what would you sort of give them?
Yeah, I basically say, I am a traveler, so I have always traveled. And the beauty of travel in the world, the way that I do it, is not knowing the answer, right? So I don't travel. I refuse to use TripAdvisor. I refuse to use anything that will tell me where to go, because I like to wander. And in a culture in societies where everything, the data, everything has to be known and everything has to be decided, and we can't build something until we know, and I can't go on holidays because I'm too scared, and I can't. The beauty of life is in the unexpected. So the advice I give everyone is just jump off that cliff, even for me, and that's change. Most people hate change. I hate change,
right?
And I change companies, but getting people to walk off a cliff on any level is the hardest thing they'll ever do. It is the most rewarding thing in life.
Well, that's beautiful. Sentence to end on. Where can people connect with you online, or I mean, are you on any of the social platforms or via email if they have question or anything?
Yeah, they can. I mean, I'm on Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn there, and it's always Mel McVeigh. So you will find me there, and you'll get a mix of some product and a lot more increasingly about photography and storytelling. So it won't feel like the product world, but it is kind of the mix of the two. So you can reach out there.
All right, perfect. Well, I know you got to jump to the next meeting pretty soon. So thank you very, very much for this very interesting conversation. Thanks everyone in the audience for listening, and I hope you'll be back. Yeah. Lorenzo liked it as well. Great. Thanks. And yeah, thank you very much, Mel.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.